All right, YouTube, you've seen that the situation in Iraq isn't exactly stable right now. Hundreds of protesters stormed the Green Zone, entered Parliament, started breaking windows, attacking things, breaking furniture. Some people were burning cars. That may sound like par for the course for most parts of the Middle East, and that's true. But now there are thousands more protesters as well. What has happened is that the government there is corrupt, doesn't really know what it's doing, doesn't represent anyone anymore. And this tends to be the case with governments that are installed essentially by the United States, that is, the US, to make up the investment made into invading a country and destroying it. In order to make that worthwhile, they have to install a government that will pay them back over time, really, once they've become settled. And Iraq has enjoyed some degree of stability over time, with the exception of ISIS incursions. They had been driven back. Now it's actually the government of Iraq itself, the US backed government, that's really to blame for the instability there now. So if you're an Iraqi, you're sort of between a cock and a hard place. You've got ISIS on one side constantly trying to fuck things up. Then you've got the government being corrupt, the government administrating the military that's keeping ISIS at bay. So it becomes a little bit of an issue there. A lot of people, I'm sure, long for the good old days of Saddam Hussein, back when they were led by a tyrant, but at least it was a predictable tyrant that they knew would kill you if you said the wrong thing, and they knew specifically what those wrong things were. Now they've got to deal with ISIS, which is something that they hadn't had to deal with really before. They've got to deal with a government that's supposedly secular, even though it's not, doesn't know what it's doing, fucks the economy, fucks the people, is just as tyrannical almost as Saddam anyway. And I feel very sorry for the people there that really have to deal with this shit. We should have left Saddam in place. Now, a lot of people constantly wonder, well, who is to blame for what's wrong with Iraq? Well, some people say Obama, because they say, well, he withdrew troops too early. If he had left at least a contingent of troops in, more than a few hundred, just at a few embassies or whatever. If he had left a few thousand more troops in, the country would be more stable, because they could have prevented ISIS from gaining ground there, even though we would have had to pay through the nose for this. They could have prevented ISIS from making any more gains. They could have kept al-Qaeda to a bare minimum. They could have continued to prop up the government there while it rebuilt more and more stability, had better trained troops, better supplied troops. By better supplied, I don't mean just they use U.S. surplus. I mean they know how to use it, which appears not to have been the case in some of their battles. And then some people go back further. They say, no, we had to withdraw. It was Bush's fault for getting us in the first place and removing Saddam Hussein. You can certainly make that argument as well. They would say Bush should have left it alone. Saddam was bad, yes, but look at what's happened now and how many people have died. Was it really worth it? Were lives saved or were more lives lost as the result of getting rid of Saddam, who, let's face it, eventually would have died anyway, and then maybe one of his crazy sons would be in power, or maybe Chemical Ali or somebody like that. And then myself, I say, no, fundamentally, Bush and Obama both suck and they both screwed up royally, but really the British are to blame. The British are to blame for taking that land from the Ottomans, who had administered it for centuries, knew how to deal with the locals, and respected the tribal traditions, and carving out a nation state out of different groups of people who couldn't stand one another. Now, as long as they were united under the Ottoman banner, there were fewer problems. Yeah, you've got the odd fucking heretic or rebel or whatever raising hell in some remote village somewhere, but ultimately things were taken care of. The government that was responsible for administering the region was, not that far away in Turkey, specifically, of course, Istanbul at the time. Formerly Constantinople, and many people have a thorn in their ass about that as well. But the Ottomans were regional. They were within the region already. They knew how to deal with such shit. Whereas the British certainly didn't. The British, anywhere where they carved out a border out of some place that they had gained as an acquisition, as a colony, as a territory, as something they temporarily administered as a mandate, like Palestine, which Transjordan Palestine became Jordan, Palestine, and Israel. They put all the Jews there after they realized that they had accidentally killed a few 100,000 of them in a typhus epidemic by bombing things in Germany the wrong way. essentially the British were the ones that truly screwed up. But we can't. We have to go back perhaps even further because that region had been fought over at various times by Greeks, by Romans, by Persians, by everybody fucking else under the sun. For no real apparent reason, most of this region is just arid desert. There are some rivers there. Yes, there are some areas you can grow grain in, and it's a good trading location. It's a nice central location built really upon the back of trade within the Levant and Iraq, Levant and Mesopotamia. But the people of Iraq are almost united now in hatred of their government, whether they're Shia or Sunni. It no longer makes a difference. The people of Iraq finally agree on something. The government that was installed by the United States is brutal and corrupt, inept, and really letting the country fall apart at the seams. So at least they agree upon something, I suppose, even if it's that the government has to go and the bad old days of even more chaos have to come back. See, there's the problem. They oust the government. Maybe they'll put in a bunch of Islamic hardliners that'll be friendly to ISIS or Al-Qaeda. Well, then, of course, the United States has to choose whether to lose its investment, hundreds of billions of dollars and many thousands of lives, and watch another country fall into essentially the hands of ISIS, which will gain more than just a toehold or a foothold in the region, but a stranglehold over it. Or whether to intervene yet again in some manner and potentially start War in Iraq 3.0. Well, goody goody. I'm sure that Obama's chomping at the bit wanting to do that. He wants an excuse to go back into the region. He'll probably ignore the problems in Iraq, use it as a launching pad against Assad's forces, which we all know that he's very eager to do. The United States has put itself in the business of making money and making inroads in the Middle East by taking secular dictators that, yes, are brutal and tyrannical, and turning these countries into so-called democracies that don't actually function like democracies. They function like little more than U.S. territories. It's, in a way, a type of colonialism when you really think about it, but it's all that much more despotic. We're not supplying them with protection. We're not there ensuring their stability. We simply leave once the job's done or never even set foot there to begin with, and just funded somebody else to do it, and then gained a pawn. And that pawn, as long as it continues to feed us a little bit of money and oil, can do basically whatever it wants. It wasn't so much Bush used the excuse Saddam's evil, WMD's whatever, under the sun, whatever excuse he could cook up. Saddam's evil, essentially. He's too brutal to be in power. He's a tyrant. But really, I mean, the things replacing all of these dictators invariably are just as violent as the dictators that were kicked out by the United States or its proxy forces to begin with. Now, I'm no big fan of Russia, and of course I do see this in the context of a grand chessboard, but I like to think that there are more reasonable, sane ways to go about this. Build an actual democracy and it might function. Or try to wine and dine some dictator and talk them down from the ledge of constantly purging their own people. I'd think that'd be a little more effective because then it increases your popular image abroad and you get less of this shit aimed at your own country. I would think that that would make economic and social sense and save a lot of lives. But of course, Uncle Sam has forsaken all concept of common sense lately. So yeah, Iraq is kind of spiraling into chaos right now. It's got some severe problems, and they're not likely, let's face it, to get better because the Iraqi government right now is about as popular as Dilma or Maduro or something like that. I wouldn't be surprised if the people eventually, I wouldn't be surprised to see another Libya situation, and yet another incarnation of Iraqi government is overthrown. How many overthrows is that in the last decade? You've probably lost count. It's impossible to even estimate the number of people killed or disappeared into some gulag dungeon somewhere out in the desert because we don't even necessarily have the assets there to tell what the fuck is going on. And they say, oh, well, don't worry, the situation is stable. This is the Prime Minister of Iraq. Oh, the situation's stable. Is that why there are like 10,000 protesters trying to storm the green area now? It was just a few hundred yesterday or earlier today. I don't know the time zone of Iraq, so I can't tell. But now it's like 10,000, maybe 20,000. An enormous crowd of people waving Iraqi flags trying to storm into this region, go into parliament and fuck around. Well, how are you going to deal with that situation? You're going to kill all these people, crack down? Do you even have the resources to do so? since I know you're so busy fighting ISIS and losing 3 or 4 men to every ISIS terrorist you manage to kill. So yeah, it's a difficult situation. That's about all. Peace out.